So I'm about to make a comparison that's going to sound crazy on the surface, but bear with me and see if you agree at the end. I get this feeling that there's a lot of vitriol towards a game like Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee, because it's doing things that are different than what has been done in traditional Pokemon games in the past. And not just things that are different, but things that are at least self-perceived as casual? Is that safe to say? It feels weird even saying that, given that Pokemon itself has always been what I at least consider an entry-level RPG. What I mean to say is it's a rather simplistic RPG that has added mechanics and stuff over time, especially for the competitive scene, but it's still one of the easiest RPGs to get into, one of the easiest ones to understand, and certainly isn't at the level of some of the more complex RPGs out there. If we want to stick with Nintendo, Xenoblade Chronicles 2 arguably has more complex systems in place and is a more complex overall RPG than Pokemon. Now, that isn't to discredit Pokemon or its complexities, but the idea that this could somehow be simplified even more seems to be bothering a lot of people, especially when it comes to mechanics that have been part of the series from the beginning. You guys know what I'm talking about. The capture mechanics, as an example, no longer whittling down Pokemon and having to focus more on how you throw a Pokeball versus battling a character down or a Pokemon down and capturing it by just auto-throwing a ball. And stuff like of that nature. Seeing the Pokemon out in the overworld, blah, 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 blah. So here's my thing. I think, at least for me, we've got to remember, this is a very personal opinion, but I think Pokemon Let's Go Eevee and Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu is essentially Pokemon's version of Breath of the Wild. Now, let me be clear. We're not talking about excitement levels and hype levels. We all know heading into the release of Breath of the Wild, it was some of the most hype-ness ever, not just in Zelda franchise history, but in Nintendo history. The hype levels for Breath of the Wild were massive. Nintendo took a huge risk in 2016, making their E3 basically about one video game, but that video game ended up being so good it won all the E3 awards, all the Game Awards, one of the highest rated games of all time, and ended up just blowing up on Switch and even a little bit on Wii U. But here's the thing. Breath of the Wild is not beloved by the entire Zelda fan base. In fact, there is a very strong contingent of Zelda fans that don't really like Breath of the Wild. And the reason they don't like it is for the very same reasons I feel like there are a huge, at least it feels like a huge, portion of the Pokemon fan base that is fighting back against Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee, despite the fact that there's a promise of a proper Gen 8 Pokemon game next year. And that contingent is that the game is doing things different from the norm, and I don't like it. So that's like a Breath of the Wild. Forget the open world nature. Zelda games leading into Breath of the Wild had basically started to become very formulaic. And we're not just talking about in terms of how the story is presented and all that stuff, but just in terms of how a game is presented. So it is very linear, right? Skyward Sword was obviously one of the most linear, Zelda games ever made. But in general, outside of like A Link Between Worlds and A Link to the Past and games of that ilk, a lot of the 3D, a lot of the console 3D Zelda games were very not as open world as people like to remember them. A lot of people think Ocarina of Time was extremely open world, but it really isn't. Like, all these games were pretty linear in their structure, in their storytelling, and how they presented the game, and how they wanted you to progress through dungeons and all of that stuff. And then another key aspect that I guess of Zelda games of the past has been dungeons. Now, if you had a hard press to ask someone what makes a Zelda game Zelda, like how would you describe a Zelda game? Generally, you really go down a couple paths. Exploration, dungeon crawler, or a dungeon crawler exploration game, because that's really a good definition of Zelda. Now there's a lot of other ways you can go with it, a lot of personal avenues, but that's the way I've always looked at Zelda, is it's based on exploration and it's a dungeon crawler. Dungeons have been huge in every single Zelda game until Breath of the Wild. Now, I understand the arguments that shrines replace dungeons and blah, 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 but in general, people just consider the 4, or I guess 5 now, divine beasts to kind of be the only traditional dungeons in the game. Everything else kind of a side quest, side dungeon ordeal. And here's the thing, those dungeons were supposed to be epic, right? Like, when we heard heading into Breath of the Wild that it was going to only have 4 dungeons in the game at first, we kept thinking, well, okay, if it's only going to have 4 dungeons instead of 6, 7, 8, 9, 12 like we're used to, these are going to be the biggest dungeons in Zelda history, and they're going to really tie into the world. It's going to be epic and awesome, and it's going to take hours to trek through them. And reality is they're extremely short. Most of them are beatable in under a half hour if you know what you're doing, and it wasn't that exciting. I admit the Divine Beasts were probably some of my biggest letdowns in the game. The events leading into the Divine Beasts, the story elements leading in, were more exciting to me than the act of actually doing anything inside the Divine Beasts. Even if I felt some of the mechanics within the mechanisms and everything were really cool and unique, it just was really short-sighted in my opinion. But here's the thing. This is one of the reasons that Zelda fans, specific Zelda fans anyways, do not like this game. Do not like Breath of the Wild. World is too big, world is too empty, world doesn't have any true dungeons in it, and while it's based in exploration, the story is all completely optional. That's never been the case in Zelda outside of Zelda 1, and it just really irks people. Yet, popular opinion is that Breath of the Wild is one of the best games ever crafted, and it's also, right now, the most popular Zelda game ever made. And I feel like this is what is happening with Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee. So the difference between Breath of the Wild and the difference between Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee heading into launch is that these major changes in Breath of the Wild were not really known until the game came out. Nobody really knew how these dungeons were going to take shape or how the story was really going to take shape. No one really understood this until we experienced it to know if we disliked it. We know the new mechanics and the changes in Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee already. We know them, and we can have a pretty good idea on if we're going to like them or not. Even if I try to argue with people that you don't really understand how difficult it is to catch a Pokemon, I don't really think this is casualizing catching Pokemon. I think this is just changing it and doing something different, and that different might be more challenging in some cases. Still, you can kind of get a grasp of what the changes are and know if you're going to like them or not. So I think that's the difference between heading into launch is that. Breath of the Wild, lots of promise, but we didn't really know what the end result was going to be. Let's Go Pikachu, not really promising much, has the changes, but we don't know how much that's going to, or we do know how much that's going to change things. So here is how I look at it in the grand scheme. Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee are going to be chastised for the changes they've made, for the eliminating the battling Pokemon, whittling them down in order to capture them, and for getting rid of random encounters and having it all be Pokemon you see out in the world. Like, I actually wanted Pokemon to be, so I'm actually happy by the change. But these are two major changes. So far, the only major changes we know. But they are changes to the fundamentals of Pokemon that have been in place forever. Just like the climbing mechanics in Breath of the Wild, just like not really having traditional dungeons, all of that was big changes as well. But here is the thing. I think just like Breath of the Wild's popularity exploded and clearly showed that these aspects that so many core Zelda fans love are not nearly as important as they thought they were, I think that's what's going to happen with Pokemon Let's Go Eevee and Let's Go Pikachu. I think Pokemon Let's Go Eevee and Let's Go Pikachu are not only going to be successful and sell well, I think they have the potential to be the best-selling mainline Pokemon games of all time, specifically because of these changes and the appeal these changes are going to have. And so, again, this might fit into your casualizing Pokemon arguments, but as I've said, Pokemon itself has always been a casual kind of game. It's always had that sort of appeal to bring gamers in that aren't really into super hardcore mechanics. That's kind of been the biggest appeal and the biggest draw of Pokemon for the past 20 years. So I don't really think you can casualize that experience anymore unless you're making something like Pokemon Shuffle, I suppose, but like that already exists, so go play it. I guess you can argue Pokemon Go itself is casualized, but I mean, a lot of the people that play Pokemon Go were Pokemon fans or lapsed Pokemon fans. So is that really a casual thing, or is that just appealing to people who like Pokemon and just haven't been playing them in a while? I don't know. I mean, here's my thing. I'm not here to argue that Pokemon Go players on the whole are going to go plop down $360 to buy a Switch and buy one of these games. That's been the number one counter argument against why Pokemon Go is not going to help this game be successful. I think these people are already looking at getting a Switch anyways. I think the appeal of Switch sits and fits well with people who like to game on the go. And wouldn't you know, when you're playing Pokemon Go on the go, you are gaming on the go. So you're already thinking about gaming on the go and doing it in these social settings. And that's exactly the target audience that Switch actually hits on. The young adults that are on the go and in social settings. That's what Switch is literally catering itself to. So it's not just that I think they're going to be picking up Switches. I think they're going to buy a Switch anyway because they want to buy a Switch. Yes, Pokemon could push them over, but they're not looking at it as I'm buying a Switch to play Pokemon. They want a Switch. Is what I'm trying to get at. I don't think a majority, of course, of Pokemon Go players want a Switch, but I'm just saying that like even a 1% of that audience, if they buy a Switch, would make Switch the most successful platform of all time and would have the most successful Pokemon game of all time. Like, I'm not even talking about a huge percentage of them. Just a small amount is all it takes. And on top of that, Pokemon Go has such a broad appeal that I think Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee is going to have that kind of broad appeal as well. Not just to Pokemon Go players. I feel like that's been the discussion right now. It's how many Pokemon Go players are really going to buy this? Just to gamers in general. I think the idea of capturing Pokemon through throwing a Mystic Pokeball controller or throwing the act of throwing something, the act of simplifying the capture mechanics, even if I just think it's a change, is something. And seeing the Pokemon, I think seeing the Pokemon in the overworld is going to be the big attraction. That's going to draw in people who already own Switch or are thinking about buying a Switch for other games, but have never been interested in Pokemon before. I think Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee is going to create more Pokemon fans in a similar fashion to Breath of the Wild, where Breath of the Wild became the most successful and highest-selling Zelda game of all time by appealing to a bunch of people who have never played Zelda before. I think that's what's going to happen with Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee. These core mechanic changes, just like in Breath of the Wild, are going to appeal to a much broader audience that are not currently Pokemon fans. So not only are you going to get some carryover from the existing Pokemon fan base, it's going to attract in this whole brand new audience. That's my opinion. I can't back this up till after the game comes out, but I'm seeing a lot of parallels here with Breath of the Wild because there is a large chunk of Zelda fans that are not big fans of Breath of the Wild for the reasons I already talked about, and that's kind of the same chunk of Pokemon fans that are not fans of Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee already because of the changes that have happened. But it doesn't matter because both games, I think, are going to appeal to these massively broad audience of gamers that never considered playing these kind of games in the past. And I feel like that's the entire point of Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee, is to appeal to that crowd. And again, we're not going to know, obviously, until after the game comes out and we see how well it sells, and if sales explode and if it's breaking records, we'll know pretty quickly if Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee is doing what I think it's going to do in moving millions of Switches and getting millions of new people to try out Pokemon. But I think it's going to happen. And I'm just saying this because the line for Let's Go Pikachu, Let's Go Eevee was so long at E3. People I talked to who had never played Pokemon before waited in line to play that thing 4.5 hours. Like again, I know it's just one venue, one event, one situation, but I'm telling you that I'm getting this feeling like almost down to my core that this is going to be highly comparable to Breath of the Wild at the end of the day, where it's going to alienate a huge chunk of the core audience, but it's going to introduce so many new gamers to the franchise that it's going to trump all of the people that are honestly afraid. So I hear you, hardcore Pokemon fans. I understand why you're not digging these changes, why you're not into this, why you don't think this is going to be successful. But the same reasons you don't think it's going to be successful is the exact reasons why it's going to be successful, because there's a ton of reasons why Pokemon has not grown over the years, and this kind of breaks down those barriers and gets some new people in. People aren't always into random encounters. What's a common thing in RPGs everywhere, whether the JRPGs or not? Random encounters are kind of gone. Random encounters limit your audience. Now you can see the Pokemon. You know what you're going to battle. You know what you want to capture. You know a lot more information about what's happening in the game world. And I feel like that's just really going to bring people in. On top of the fact that it's using a mechanic that many of them have obviously at least maybe even tried out on their phones. So I don't know. That's just my 2 cents. You guys let me know what you think down in the comments below. I know a bunch of you aren't going to, are either going to argue how it's going to be a success, not going to be a success. My comparison's crazy. But honestly, I know my comparison is crazy, but I feel like I'm going to be proven right. I'm not ready to stake my whole YouTube channel on it, but I am very confident that Breath of the Wild is almost like a blueprint for what's going to happen with Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee. Anyways, folks, I'm Nathaniel Rovagents from the Nintendo Prime, and if you like this video, you know what to do. And if you dislike the video, hit that dislike button, subscribe for more content, and I'll catch you in the next one.
Yes.